The moment Ida Langston stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, on a blistering afternoon in August of 1878, she had exactly $4.30 to her name, a cracked leather traveling bag, and the kind of grief that settles into a person's bones like winter frost and refuses to melt. The town of Caldwell sprawled along the southern edge of Kansas like something half-finished, its main street a wide stretch of packed red dirt flanked by wooden storefronts, a handful of saloons, a livery, a dry goods store, and a two-story building with a hand-painted sign that read Hattie Bloom's boarding house, clean rooms, fair rates, no trouble. Cattle drives still rolled through this corridor regularly, pushing longhorns north from Texas along the Kishom Trail, and the air on any given day carried with it the low rumble of hooves and the sharp smell of livestock and dust. It was not a pretty town, but it was a town, and that mattered more to Ida right now than beauty ever had. She stood on the boardwalk with her bag clutched in both hands, watching the stagecoach roll on down the road without her, and she breathed slowly, deliberately, the way her mother had taught her to do when the world felt like it was tipping sideways. Her mother was gone now. That was the reason she was here, 400 miles from the small Missouri farm where she had spent 24 years of her life, standing in a strange town with dust on her boots and a heart full of things she had not yet found the words to properly grieve. She had sold the farm. She had not wanted to, but her father had passed 2 years before her mother, and there was no one left to work the land, and the bank had made it clear in language both polite and immovable that the remaining debt would swallow the property whole if she tried to hold on to it. Her father's cousin in Caldwell, a man named Victor Langston, had written to her 6 months ago with an offer come west, help manage his general store, earn a wage, build something new. The letter had felt like a lifeline then. She had written back, received one more brief reply confirming the arrangement, and then begun preparing to leave everything she had ever known. She did not yet know that Victor Langston had died of a fever 3 weeks ago, just long enough before her arrival that the news had not managed to catch up with her on the road. She found out from a sunburned man sweeping the steps of the general store, who looked at her with something between sympathy and mild discomfort, and told her that Mr. Langston had been buried in the church cemetery on the north end of town, and that his widow had already sent word to relatives in Ohio and intended to close the store within the month. He was very sorry, he said. He did not look particularly sorry, but Ida did not hold it against him. She thanked him with steady composure, turned away from the store, and walked 3 steps before she stopped and pressed her hand flat against the wooden post of a hitching rail, and simply stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing. The sun was merciless. The grief was familiar. She had learned, in these past 2 years of loss stacked upon loss, that the only thing to do with another blow was to stand up straight inside it and keep moving. So she picked up her bag, smoothed her dark blue traveling dress, and walked down the main street toward Hattie Bloom's boarding house, because she needed a room and she needed to think, and those were the only 2 things she could afford to focus on right now. The inside of the boarding house was dim and smelled pleasantly of wood polish and something baking, likely cornbread. A woman in her 50s with a wide, honest face and steel-gray hair pulled tight under a cotton cap stood behind a short wooden desk near the door, and she looked up at Ida with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to reading travelers quickly. "Room for the night?" the woman asked. She was Hattie Bloom herself, as she confirmed without being asked, in the way that confident people sometimes did. "For longer than a night, if possible," Ida said. "I have arrived to find my situation rather different than I expected, and I will need time to arrange new employment. I can pay for tonight and part of tomorrow, and I can work if that helps cover the rest." Hattie studied her for a moment, apparently decided she was both honest and reasonably capable, and nodded. "I've got 1 bunk left, the last room on the 2nd floor. Not fancy, but it's clean and it has a window, $1.50 for the week. I'll take the work. I need someone to help with the laundry starting Monday." "Agreed," Ida said, and let out a breath so quietly that it was barely a sound at all. What neither of them knew yet was that Jeremiah Fletcher had put his name down for that last bunk 2 days ago, and had ridden into Caldwell not 40 minutes behind Ida's stagecoach, arriving on a roan quarter horse named Gideon, his saddlebags light and his intentions straightforward. He was 27 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who work outside from childhood tend to be, with dark brown eyes that had a habit of looking at things very directly, and hands that were calloused from rope and leather and years of cattle work. He had spent the better part of the last 5 years riding with various cattle outfits along the Kisham Trail, picking up work where he could find it and moving on when the season ended or the drive concluded. He was not precisely a restless man, though people sometimes assumed he was. He was more accurately described as a man who had not yet found the thing worth stopping for. He had a quiet manner that some people mistook for coldness until they spent time enough with him to recognize it was simply the way he was careful with words, not because he had little to say, but because he thought it mattered to say things accurately. He had come to Caldwell this particular August because a rancher named Dale Prout, who ran cattle north of town and was a reasonably fair employer, had sent word along the trail network that he was short-handed and looking for experienced drovers for the autumn gather. The work paid well enough. The boarding house was the obvious place to stay until he figured out whether Prout's operation suited him. He walked into Hattie Bloom's boarding house and found Hattie behind her desk and a dark-haired young woman in a blue dress disappearing up the staircase with a traveling bag, and he set his hat on the edge of the desk and told Hattie he was Jeremiah Fletcher and he had reserved a bunk. Hattie looked at him with the expression of a woman caught between two legitimate claims and not entirely comfortable about it. "I just let that room to a young woman who arrived in town to find her relative had died," Hattie said plainly. "She had nowhere else to go and very little money, and I did not think to check my book before I said yes. I am sorry, Mr. Fletcher. I will of course return the room to you if you insist. You did reserve it first, but I wanted to be honest with you about the situation." Jeremiah looked up at the staircase where the woman had disappeared, and then he looked back at Hattie, and there was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds in which he appeared to consider the matter. "She can keep it," he said. Hattie blinked. "I beg your pardon. She can keep the room," he said again, quietly and without fanfare. "She needs it more than I do. I'll sleep in the stable if Burrow will have me. He usually does. Jeremiah, it's August but the night's still." "I've slept in worse than a stable, Miss Hattie," he said, and there was no self-pity in it, only the plain delivery of a fact. He picked up his hat from the desk, nodded at her, and walked back out the door without asking for anything in return, not even acknowledgement, not even a thank you passed along second-hand. Hattie stood at her desk for a moment after he left, looking at the door, and then she looked up the staircase, and she thought to herself that she had seen a great many men pass through Caldwell over the years, and very few of them would have done what that man just did. Ida, unpacking her few belongings in the small room on the second floor with its clean white quilts and its window overlooking the back alley and the distant, flat Kansas horizon, had no idea any of this had happened. She did not find out until the next morning. She had slept heavily, the way the body insists upon after genuine exhaustion, and she came down the narrow staircase in the early blue light of the Kansas morning to find Hattie already in the small dining room, setting out a breakfast of biscuits and salt pork and a pot of strong coffee, the kind of plain abundance that a working boarding house provided. There was one other boarder at the table, a wiry man of perhaps 50 with spectacles and the ink-stained fingers of someone in the printing trade, who introduced himself as Mr. Elias Cobb and said he was setting type for the Caldwell commercial and had been in residence for 3 months. Hattie poured Ida a cup of coffee and sat down across from her with the comfortable directness of a woman who had long since stopped worrying about small social ceremonies and told her about Jeremiah Fletcher. "He had that room reserved," Hattie said. "Put his name down 2 days ago by letter. Came in last evening right after you went upstairs, heard the situation, and told me to let you keep it. Said he would sleep in Burl's stable, didn't make a thing of it." Ida held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at Hattie with an expression that was difficult to read, partly surprised, partly something softer and harder to name. "He did that without even seeing me?" she asked. "Without even knowing your name," Hattie confirmed. Elias Cobb looked up from his biscuit. "That would be Jeremiah Fletcher. Good man. Worked with Dale Pruitt's outfit last autumn. Quiet fellow but fair." Ida set her cup down carefully. "I should thank him." "You'll likely find him at Burl's stable or at the feed yard next to it," Hattie said. "He tends to be up before the sun." She was right. Ida put on her second dress, the brown one with the cream collar, and walked through the early morning quiet of Caldwell's Main Street, past the dry goods store that would not be hers now, past the barber shop with its striped pole and its shuttered windows, and turned down the side alley toward the livery stable owned by a man called Burl Tackett, who was indeed already up and forking hay into the stalls with the slow, reliable rhythm of a man who had done this particular thing 10,000 times. Jeremiah was in the last stall, brushing down the roan horse he called Gideon, and he looked up when he heard her footsteps on the packed earth floor without stopping what he was doing. He was in his shirt sleeves, the collar open, and he had the particular quality of physical ease that comes with genuine comfort in one's own body and surroundings. He did not look like a man who had slept on straw and considered it a hardship. "Mr. Fletcher," Ida said, and her voice was steady, but there was a warmth in it that she had not entirely planned. "Yes, ma'am," he said simply. "I'm Ida Langston. I'm in the room you were supposed to have." Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile but was near one. "I know," he said. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "It was a very generous thing to do, and you did not even know me, and I wanted you to know that I understand what it cost you." He considered that for a moment, still working the brush along Gideon's flank in slow, easy strokes. "It did not cost me much," he said. "I've slept in stables before. You likely had not." "No," she admitted. "I had not." There was a pause then, the comfortable kind that does not demand to be filled, with the horses moving quietly in their stalls and the early light coming in slanted and gold through the open stable doors. And Ida found herself thinking that she could not remember the last time a silence had felt anything other than heavy. "Are you finding your way all right?" he asked. "Hattie told me a little about the cousin." Ida blinked. "She told you?" "This morning when I came to wash up. She worries about people." He said it without any particular judgment. It was simply the truth about Hattie Bloom, stated without editorializing. "I am not yet sure what I will do," Ida said honestly. "I have very little money and I promised Hattie help with the laundry, but that will not be enough to keep me long. I am a reasonably capable woman. I can cook and sew and keep books. My father taught me his accounts when I was 12. Jeremiah looked at her then directly, and she returned the look without flinching, because she had long since decided that there was no dignity in looking away from honest observation. His eyes were dark and steady, and there was nothing in them that was unkind. "Cal Pruitt's wife runs the supply end of the ranch operation," he said. "I heard she was looking for someone to help with accounts and correspondence. Might be worth asking." "I will," Ida said. And then, because it felt like the honest thing to say, "You are kinder than I expected a stranger to be." He looked back at the horse. "I just did what made sense," he said. She walked back to the boarding house in the growing morning light, and she felt, for the first time since she had packed her life into a single bag and climbed onto that stagecoach, something that was tentatively, carefully hopeful. The weeks that followed were the kind that build a life sideways in small increments without announcing themselves as significant. Ida spoke to Clara Pruitt, the rancher's wife, who was a compact and businesslike woman of 40 who had strong opinions about record-keeping and immediate respect for anyone who understood double-entry bookkeeping. She hired Ida within 20 minutes of their first meeting, offering a modest but livable wage and the use of a small spare room at the ranch house for the days she worked out there. Ida continued helping Hattie with laundry on the days she was in town, and gradually, the $4.30 she had arrived with stopped mattering quite so much. She saw Jeremiah Fletcher with a frequency that started feeling like more than coincidence, and arrived at the comfortable conclusion that Caldwell was simply a small enough town, that people who were both reliably early risers were going to cross paths regularly. He had taken the work with Dale Pruitt's ranch operation and was riding long days out on the range, doing the hard autumn labor of gathering cattle that had drifted across miles of Kansas grassland over the summer and bringing them back to be counted and sorted. He came to Hattie's for supper on evenings when he was not camping out on the range, and Hattie kept a plate warm for him without being asked, because that was also the truth about Hattie Bloom. The first time they sat at the supper table together and talked properly, it was a Tuesday evening in late August, and the heat had finally broken into something almost bearable, and Elias Cobb was there with his ink-stained fingers and his habit of asking questions that the newspaper trade had built into him, so the conversation had a shape it might not otherwise have had. He asked Ida about Missouri, and she talked about the farm and the river and the way the corn grew, and she talked about her mother's garden and the way her father could fix almost anything mechanical with whatever pieces were at hand. She did not yet talk about losing them, but she talked around it in ways that anyone paying attention could read clearly. Jeremiah was paying attention. He said very little himself that evening, but the things he said were the right things, not the easy, automatic comforts that people offer when they do not know what else to do, but actual responses to what she had actually said, which told her he had been listening to all of it. He had grown up in western Texas, he said when Elias turned the questions his direction, on a small ranch near the Pecos River. His father had been a cattle man his whole life, and his mother had died when Jeremiah was 11, and after that it had been his father and him, and a rotating cast of trail hands and the horses and the land. He spoke about all of this the way he seemed to speak about everything, directly, without dressing it up or stripping it down. "Do you miss Texas?" Ida asked him, and it was the first time that evening she had directed a question specifically at him, and they both seemed to notice it at the same moment. "I miss the river," he said after a pause. "The Pecos. It's not a pretty river, but it's familiar, and familiar things have their own kind of beauty." She thought about the Missouri River and about the particular light that fell over the water in the late afternoon in September, and she understood exactly what he meant. They walked out to the front porch of the boarding house after supper, not quite together and not quite separately, and stood in the cooling night air while the sounds of Caldwell settled into the quieter register of evening distant music from one of the saloons, the occasional passage of a horse down the main street, the low conversation of men on the saloon porches. The sky above the flat Kansas horizon was extravagant with stars, the way skies in the West always were, and Ida looked up at them and felt the strange and complicated feeling of a person beginning to realize that the place they landed might not be entirely the wrong one. "I owe you for the room," she said again, quietly. She had said it before. She meant it differently now. "You don't," he said, and then, because he was precise with words, "You paid me back already." She looked at him. "How?" He took a breath and looked out at the street, and she could see the slight tension of someone choosing their words carefully. "Company," he said finally. "I eat supper alone most nights." It was not a declaration. It was barely even a confession, but it landed in her chest with a warmth she had not been prepared for, and she looked back up at the stars and said nothing, and that silence between them was not empty at all. September came in with a dry wind and the smell of distant burning, the grass fires that sometimes rolled across the Kansas plains in the dry season, though none came close enough to Caldwell to threaten. The cattle work at Pruitt's ranch intensified as the gather progressed, and Jeremiah was out on the range more often than not, riding long days with the other drovers, and coming back to the bunkhouse at Prout's in the evenings, when the distance made a return to town impractical. On the days he was in town, he made a habit of stopping by the boarding house before he went to the stable to check on Gideon, and if Ida was at the desk in Hattie's small sitting room, where she sometimes worked on the ranch accounts in the evenings, they would talk. Those conversations became the thing Ida noticed herself thinking about when she was not in them. She was not a woman given to romantic fantasy. She had been practical by both nature and necessity for most of her life, and the grief of the past 2 years had further refined her down to a kind of essential, no-nonsense steadiness that she wore like a second skin. She had never had much patience for the idea that love was something that arrived in the form of grand gestures and trembling speeches. Her parents had loved each other with a quiet, consistent devotion, her father bringing her mother the first wildflowers of spring every year without fail, her mother mending his coats so carefully that the repaired places were always stronger than the original fabric, and that was the version of love she understood and believed in. Jeremiah Fletcher was a quiet man who had given up a bed for a stranger and slept without complaint in a stable, and remembered the things people said to him, and brought her a small cluster of late-season wildflowers one afternoon in September simply because he had ridden past a patch of them on the open plain and thought she might like them. She put them in a water glass on her windowsill and looked at them for a long time. There was a fair that came to Caldwell in the middle of September, the kind of traveling exhibition that moved through frontier towns along the trail routes, with a livestock competition and a few merchants selling goods from wagons and a caller who announced the proceedings through a brass-speaking horn. Half the town showed up. Ranchers brought their best horses and their most promising young cattle. Women from the homesteads outside of town came in with quilts and preserves to display. The saloons did brisk business, and the dust rose in a steady haze above the main street from all the activity. Ida went because Hattie insisted, and because she had done very little in Caldwell that was not work, and she found herself moving through the stalls and displays with genuine pleasure, the way a person does when they have been allowing themselves to forget that pleasure is a legitimate use of time. She watched the horse competition with the absorbed attention of someone who had grown up around working animals and knew what she was looking at, and she was there, leaning on the fence rail with a small smile on her face, when Jeremiah Fletcher brought Gideon through his paces in the working horse exhibition. He did not show off. That was what she noticed most. Some of the other riders pushed their horses to impressive speeds and dramatic stops, playing to the crowd. Jeremiah simply rode, and Gideon moved under him with a precision and responsiveness that told you everything you needed to know about the quality of their work together. They ran a clean pattern, cut a steer from the small practice herd with neat efficiency, and stood quietly at the fence while the judge made his notes. They placed second, behind a rancher from south of town who had a magnificent gray horse, and Jeremiah accepted the red ribbon without any visible disappointment and came over to where Ida was standing at the fence. "He worked well," she said. "He always does," Jeremiah said, patting the horse's neck with genuine affection. "He just doesn't like performing. He'd rather do actual work." "He sounds like someone else I know," she said, and the moment the words were out she was briefly surprised at herself, because the teasing had come easily and naturally, in the way it only does with people you have grown comfortable with. Jeremiah looked at her with that not-quite smile, and she felt the warmth of it all the way to her hands. "Come and get some pie," he said. "Mrs. Hollingsworth over at the church table makes a very good peach pie, and I have not eaten since before sunup." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the fair, and it was the most uncomplicated and simply pleasant afternoon Ida had spent in longer than she could precisely remember. They ate pie and watched a brief exhibition by a trick roper who could do things with a lasso that seemed to defy the laws of physics, and they looked at the quilts and the preserves and the various displayed goods, and Jeremiah bought her a small paper bag of roasted corn from a vendor without making a ceremony of it, just handed it to her as they walked, and she accepted it the same way, and neither of them said anything about it, because it did not require words. By the time the afternoon light turned golden and the fair crowd began to thin, they had walked together for 3 hours and talked about everything from the best method for curing saddle leather to the books Ida had read on the Missouri farm during the long winter evenings. And she had learned that Jeremiah had a particular love for history and had read everything he could find about the Civil War, which had ended 13 years ago but still shaped the landscape in ways that were visible everywhere in the West, in the men who had come out here afterward to start over, in the complicated politics of the territories, in the tension that still ran like an underground current through any room, where both Southerners and Northerners found themselves together. He had been a boy during the war, too young to fight, and he spoke about it with the careful thoughtfulness of someone who had spent real time considering what it had meant. "My father lost 2 brothers at Gettysburg," he said, as they walked back toward the boarding house in the long, slanted evening light. "He never spoke about it, but you could see it in him, the weight of it." Ida nodded. "My father fought," she said, "Illinois infantry. He came back, but not all of him did. There were parts of him that stayed on those fields." Jeremiah was quiet for a moment. "And yet they built things afterward, both of them." "Your father had a farm. Mine had a ranch." "Yes," she said. "I think the building was how they bore it." He looked at her sideways, just briefly, with an expression she could not entirely read, but that felt like recognition, the particular recognition of one person understanding that another person has looked directly at the same difficult things they have and arrived at a similar place. "That's a good way to think about it," he said. They reached the boarding house porch and stood in the evening air, and Hattie called from somewhere inside that supper was ready, and neither of them moved immediately, and the pause had that specific quality again, the one that was full of things being considered and not yet said. "Thank you for the afternoon," Ida said. "Thank you for the company," he said. And she was beginning to understand that when he said things like that, he meant them more completely than most people would. October brought a genuine chill to the Kansas mornings, and the news, traveling slowly through the boarding house breakfast table, of various events in the wider territory. The lawman Wyatt Earp was still making his name in Dodge City, about 50 miles to the northwest of them, and the cattle trade was winding down for the season. There was talk at Pruitt's ranch of a difficult winter ahead, with reports of early snow in the northern territories. The Kishom Trail would see its last drives of the year rolling through in the next few weeks before the season closed entirely. For Ida, October was the month that things began to shift and clarify in ways that were no longer small. She had been keeping the ranch accounts for nearly 2 months now, and Clara Pruitt had increased her wage and given her more responsibility, including managing the correspondence with the cattle buyers in Kansas City. She was good at it, and she knew she was good at it, and the knowledge of her own competence was itself a form of comfort in a life that had recently contained a great deal that was outside her control. She had found her footing in Caldwell. She had made something approaching a real place for herself, and the person she most wanted to tell about each small development was Jeremiah Fletcher, a fact she had stopped pretending not to notice. The first time she admitted it to herself plainly, she was sitting at the desk in Hattie's sitting room on a Thursday evening, going over a column of figures for the second time because she kept losing her place, and she realized that what was distracting her was the sound of Gideon's hoofbeats in the alley behind the boarding house, which meant that Jeremiah was back from the range and would come in through the side door in a few minutes. And she was looking forward to it more than she had looked forward to anything else all day. She put down her pen and sat with that for a moment, honestly and without flinching, which was the only way she knew how to sit with anything. She was falling in love with a man who slept in stables without complaint and brushed his horse with the same careful attention he gave everything else, and said things like, "I've slept in worse," with such genuine equanimity that you believed him. and who had never once in all their conversations said a single thing he did not mean, and who brought wildflowers without ceremony, and listened without interrupting and laughed, on the occasions when he laughed, with his whole face in a way that felt like a rare and private thing you had been trusted to see. She picked up her pen again and went back to the figures, but she was smiling while she did it. Jeremiah came in through the side door as she had known he would, and stood in the doorway of the sitting room and looked at her with the easy directness of a man who had long since stopped finding a reason to be subtle about the fact that she was the first thing he looked for when he walked into any room. "Good day," he asked. "Productive," she said. "You?" "Long," he said, "but good." He sat down in the wooden chair by the window and stretched his legs out and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way he sometimes did when he was tired, and she watched him from her place at the desk, and neither of them said anything for a while, and the room was warm with lamp light, and the smell of Hattie's evening coffee coming from the kitchen, and Ida thought that she had never in her life felt quite so at home in a place that was not yet home. The trouble came, as trouble in frontier towns often did, without much warning and from a direction that made sense only in retrospect. His name was Roy Carver, and he came riding into Caldwell in the second week of October with two companions, the kind of men who arrived in towns like this with a specific purpose that they did not announce. He had come, it emerged over several days, to collect a debt, or what he claimed was a debt from Dale Prout, the rancher who employed both Jeremiah and, through Clara, Ida. Carver said that Prout owed him money from a cattle deal that had gone sour 3 years prior, and he was not a man who accepted the word of others that the matter had been settled. Prout was a decent man, in Ida's assessment, and Clara was a fair and honest woman, and neither of them had the look of people who cheated their creditors. But Carver was the kind of man who generated anxiety simply by existing in a space, broad and heavy-featured with small eyes, and the calculated patience of someone accustomed to waiting for the most effective moment. He spent his first 2 days in Caldwell at the saloon, and his third day riding out to look at Prout's ranch, and the whole town had the low, watchful feeling that comes when something is being decided. Jeremiah said very little about Carver, which was not the same as not noticing him. Ida watched Jeremiah watch Carver at the saloon on the evening of the man's second day, and she saw the quality of his attention, not aggressive, not fearful, but the precise, calibrated watchfulness of a man who has learned to read other men's intentions. "Is there going to be trouble?" she asked him quietly, on the walk back from the saloon where she had gone to deliver a message from Hattie to the owner. "Might be," he said. "Carver's the kind of man who makes it." "Should Mr. Prout go to the sheriff?" "Sheriff Nichols is a reasonable man," Jeremiah said. "Prout's already spoken to him. It'll depend on whether Carver decides the law's going to be an obstacle or an opportunity." The situation came to its head on a Friday morning, when Carver and his men rode out to Prout's ranch, and there was a confrontation in the yard that the ranch hands who witnessed it later described in various degrees of alarmed detail. No shots were fired, but voices were raised, and one of Carver's companions put his hand on his gun before Jeremiah stepped forward from among the ranch hands and said, in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, that the man should think carefully about whether he wanted to take that next step. Carver's companion thought about it. He did not take the step. Sheriff Nichols arrived within the hour, because one of the younger hands had ridden hard for town, and the situation was contained in the grinding, bureaucratic way that law in frontier towns managed when it was functioning reasonably. Documents were produced. Dates were compared. A telegraph was sent to a land office in Wichita, and within 2 days it was established clearly enough that Carver's claimed debt had been resolved and recorded. He left Caldwell on the third day with his companions, and the particular ill grace of a man who has lost an argument, he was certain he would win. The aftermath was a tense supper at Hattie's, with Elias Cobb writing notes for what would become a brief article in the Caldwell Commercial, and Dale Prout himself at the table, looking more tired than frightened, and Clara beside him with her hand on his arm. Ida had spent the 2 days of the standoff at the ranch helping Clara with the records that needed to be produced and organized for the sheriff's review, and she had not slept especially well, and she was honest enough with herself to know that a significant portion of her sleeplessness was on account of having watched Jeremiah step forward between an angry man and his employer with that terrible, quiet steadiness. She found him later that evening, after the supper had cleared and Prute and Clara had gone home, sitting on the back steps of the boarding house in the dark with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, looking out at the wide Kansas sky. She sat down beside him, which was the sort of thing that had become natural enough between them that she did not think twice about it. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Fine," he said. And then, because he knew she could read him well enough now to see through the single word, "It's not the confrontation that wears on you, it's the anticipation of it." "You scared me," she said, and the honesty of it surprised them both because she had not meant to say it quite so directly. "When you stepped forward, I was frightened for you." He turned to look at her, and in the dim light from the boarding house windows she could see the particular quality of attention he gave things when they mattered. "I know," he said quietly. "I could see it on your face. You saw me. I always see you," he said. And then he looked away again, as if he had maybe said more than he intended, and took a drink of his cold coffee. The silence that followed was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind that happens when something true has been said and both people are deciding what to do with it. Ida looked at her hands in her lap, and then she looked up at the sky, and she thought about her father's patience and her mother's quiet certainty, and the way that the things most worth having were the ones you did not grab at. "I am glad you are not hurt," she said finally. "So am I," he said, and she could hear the slight roughness in his voice that she had come to recognize as his version of feeling things strongly. They sat together on the back steps for another hour in the cool October air, talking about small things and large things by turns, and when she finally went inside and climbed the stairs to her room, she stood at the window that overlooked the back alley and the distant dark horizon and pressed her forehead against the cool glass, and thought that she was very thoroughly and completely in love with Jeremiah Fletcher, and that she had no idea what to do about it. Except that she trusted herself to know when the moment was right, the same way she trusted herself to know when the figures in a ledger were correct. She trusted him to know it too. The night she had been thinking about came 2 weeks later, in the way that significant things often come, not with trumpets but with ordinary circumstances that create the right shape for honesty. It was a cold October evening, the sky hard and clear and brilliant with stars, and Hattie had made apple cake with some of the last of the autumn apples from the store, and Jeremiah had come in from the range early because of a lame horse that needed to rest, and it was just the two of them in the sitting room after supper because Hattie had gone to bed early with a headache, and Elias Cobb was at the newspaper office working late on the edition. Ida was reading, or trying to read, a novel she had borrowed from the small lending collection at the dry goods store. Jeremiah was mending a piece of harness with the methodical, experienced hands of someone who had been doing this since childhood. The lamp between them threw warm light over the room, and outside the wind had picked up and was making the kind of sound along the eaves that means winter is testing the doors. "I've been thinking about the spring," Jeremiah said, without looking up from the harness. "What about it?" she asked. "Whether I stay in Caldwell," he said, "or ride on." She kept her eyes on her book for a moment, then closed it. "What are you considering?" "That depends," he said, and then he did look up, and the look was the direct one, the one that did not leave room for misunderstanding, "on whether there's something here worth staying for." She held his gaze and did not look away. "Jeremiah," she said, and his name in her voice sounded the way it always did when she used it, which was like something being placed carefully and deliberately. "I think you already know the answer to that." "I think I do," he said, "but I'd rather hear it." She rose from her chair and came to sit beside him on the bench where he was working, and she folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the same directness he had always given her, because anything less would have felt dishonest, and dishonesty had never been something she was capable of when it really mattered. "I fell in love with you," she said, "somewhere between the wildflowers and the peach pie at the fair, and probably before that, if I am being fully accurate, which I prefer to be." Something crossed his face that she had never seen there before, not the near smile, not the careful consideration, but something open and unguarded, something that looked like relief the size of a season. He set the harness down. He took her hands in his, and his hands were large and rough and warm, and he held them with the same careful, deliberate attention he gave everything he cared about. "I've been in love with you since the morning you walked into that stable to thank me for a room," he said. "I didn't tell you then because it seemed too soon, and I'm not a man who says things before they're true enough to say. But it's been true from that morning." She looked at him for a moment, at his dark eyes and his honest, weathered face, and she felt the extraordinary specific peace of being exactly where she was supposed to be. She leaned forward and kissed him, gently, and with the fullness of everything she had been carrying quietly for weeks, and he kissed her back with his hand still holding hers, and the lamp throwing warm light over all of it. And outside, the wind moved through the October night with all the vast indifference of the Kansas plain. And in the small, warm room of the boarding house, Ida Langston and Jeremiah Fletcher arrived together, at the thing worth stopping for. Hattie Bloom found out the next morning at breakfast when she saw them sit down together with the particular quality of ease that people carry after something important has been settled. And she stood in the kitchen doorway with the coffee pot in her hand and looked at them for a long moment, and then looked up at the ceiling with an expression of private, satisfied confirmation, as if the universe had finally done what she had been quietly suggesting it should for the past 2 months. "More coffee," she said very calmly, and came to fill their cups. Elias Cobb noticed at supper and said absolutely nothing, but he was smiling when he looked at his plate, and Ida caught it and felt warm to her fingertips. November arrived, and with it a more serious winter, the kind that Kansas delivered without apology. The cattle drives were done for the year. The Kishom Trail went quiet. The sky turned a particular shade of flat gray that meant business, and the first real snow came in the second week of the month, covering the red dirt of Caldwell's Main Street in a clean white that made everything briefly look possible in a new way. Jeremiah had spoken to Dale Pruitt about winter work at the ranch, feeding the cattle, maintaining the fences, the steady necessary labor of keeping an operation going through the cold months, and Pruitt had agreed readily, because Jeremiah was as reliable a ranch hand as he had employed in years, and the man who steps forward in a crisis is the man you want to keep if you can. He was paid a fair wage and had the use of the bunkhouse at the ranch, but on the evenings when the weather permitted, he rode back into town to the boarding house, and those evenings had a warmth that had nothing to do with the wood stove. He and Ida fell into the specific rhythms of people who have declared themselves to each other, and are now learning the deeper architecture of that declaration. They found that they agreed on the things that mattered: honesty, fairness, the value of plain hard work, the importance of treating people with consistent dignity regardless of their station. And they found that where they disagreed, which was real and occasional and mostly about things like the proper organization of accounts and whether apple cake or pecan pie was the superior dessert, the disagreement was the kind that made things more interesting rather than less. He told her about his father, who had died 4 years ago of a lung sickness, and about the small Texas ranch that had been sold to cover debts afterward, and about the years of trail work since, moving with the seasons and the cattle. He told her about the loneliness of that life, which he said in the plain, matter-of-fact way he said most things, without self-pity, but which she heard for exactly what it was. She told him about her parents, about her father's laugh and his patience, and the way he had called her his practical girl, which was the highest compliment in his vocabulary, and about her mother's garden and her mother's hands, and the year of her father's death, when her mother had simply gotten very quiet and stayed quiet until the quiet became permanent. She cried, telling him this, for the first time since she had packed her bag and left Missouri, and he held her with the same quiet steadiness he brought to everything, and she understood that this was not a man who was frightened of other people's grief. "You have carried this a long time," he said, when the crying had run its course and she was sitting beside him with his arm around her and her head against his shoulder. "I have," she agreed, "but it feels lighter now." "Good," he said, and that was the right thing to say. December brought Christmas, and with it the particular warmth that even the roughest frontier towns managed to produce in that season, with pine branches over the doors of the shops and a church service that half the town attended. Hattie decorated the boarding house with a careful abundance pine boughs, red ribbons, candles in the windows, and hosted a Christmas supper that included Dale and Clara Prout, Elia's Cobb, a young schoolteacher named Miss Harriet Vance who had arrived in Caldwell in November, and two of the ranch hands from Prout's operation who had nowhere else to be. It was a long, generous table of the kind that frontier communities assembled around necessity, and that turned into something more than necessity. Jeremiah sat beside Ida and they talked to everyone and to each other, and after supper, when the dishes were done and the candles had burned low, he gave her a gift he had made himself, a small, carved wooden box of the kind used for jewelry or keepsakes. Its lid worked with a pattern of wildflowers, painstaking and beautiful, and she looked at it for a long time without saying anything, because the wildflowers were specific. They were the kind he had brought her in September. She looked up at him. "You made this during the evening hours at the Bunk house," he said. "I have had a lot of evenings." She kissed him in front of all of them, which made Hattie beam and Elia's Cobb look very interested in his coffee, and Dale Prout raise his glass with a warmth that said he had always known these things would work themselves out eventually. She gave Jeremiah a pair of gloves she had sewn herself from good thick leather she had bought from the tanner, lined with wool, and she had stitched his initials inside the cuff in small, careful letters. He put them on and looked at his hands in them, and she could see that he was moved by this in a way he would not quite say, and she loved him for both the being moved and the not quite saying, because they were the same man. January of 1879 was cold and quiet, and somehow the best month Ida had spent in years. The boarding house was warm, the work at the Prout ranch continued steadily, and she and Jeremiah had reached the kind of ease with each other that is the true luxury of love, the ease that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the certainty that the other person will be there through the difficulty, which is its own profound freedom. He asked her to marry him on a Tuesday, which was an ordinary day, and he did it as he did most things of importance, without excess ceremony, but with complete seriousness. They were walking back from the Prout ranch in the late afternoon, the sky gone pink and orange to the west in that extravagant way that winter sunsets in Kansas manage, and Gideon was walking along beside them because Jeremiah had been leading him rather than riding, keeping Ida company on the walk home. He stopped in the road and she stopped because he had, and he turned to face her and he said, "Ida, I would like to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" There was no ring because he did not yet have one. There was no crowd. There was the pink sky and the cold road and the horse breathing warm clouds into the winter air, and the absolute direct honesty of a man who meant every word he said. "Yes," she said, with the same directness, because it was the only true answer and she had never given any other kind. He smiled, the full smile this time, the rare one, and it was as good as she had always known it would be. They married in March of 1879, when the Kansas winter had broken into an early, tentative spring, and the first green was showing in the flat grassland around Caldwell. The ceremony was at the church on the north end of town, the same one where Victor Langston, who had brought Ida here though he never knew it, lay buried in the churchyard, and Hattie Bloom cried quietly through the whole thing and said afterward that she had known the very first morning which she had. The preacher was a steady, earnest man named Reverend Albright who performed the service with dignity and without unnecessary length. And when he pronounced them husband and wife and Jeremiah kissed her in the bright March light coming through the church windows, Ida felt something settle into place inside her with a permanence that was the opposite of loss. Dale and Clara Prout gave them a practical wedding gift: the use of a small two-room foreman's cottage on the edge of the ranch property, which had been empty for 2 years and was in need of work, but was solidly built and had a south-facing window that let in good light. The deal was that Jeremiah would take on the foreman role for the spring and summer cattle operation, and Ida would continue her accounting work with a small increase in wage to reflect her expanded responsibilities, and the cottage would be theirs to live in for as long as the arrangement worked for everyone. It was not a grand house. It had gaps in the chinking, and a door that stuck, and a wood stove that smoked in certain winds. They spent 3 weeks making it habitable before they moved in, with Jeremiah rechinked the walls on the outside, while Ida scrubbed the interior from floor to ceiling and sewed curtains for the windows from fabric she chose herself at the dry goods store, a blue and white check that let in the light without sacrificing privacy. She put her wooden box on the windowsill beside the bed, where she could see the carved wildflowers every morning. The work of building a life from the inside is quieter than the outside of it suggests. It is the management of small things: who makes the coffee in the morning, how the winter stores are organized, whose sense of temperature determines when the wood stove gets lit in the evening. Ida and Jeremiah managed these things with the same quality of honest negotiation they had applied to everything else, and what emerged was the particular, daily happiness of a household where both people are genuinely pleased to be there. He taught her to ride properly, not the side-saddle propriety she had learned as a girl, but the full working ranch style, astride and balanced, which she took to with the practical attention she brought to every skill worth learning. She taught him debellentry bookkeeping, which he accepted with the good-humored resistance of a man who understands the principle, but finds the execution fussy, and then gradually discovered was actually quite satisfying when the columns came out right. Spring was full of work. The calving season at Prout's ranch was demanding and unpredictable, and required long days that sometimes stretched into nights. But it was also full of the specific beauty that the Kansas plains produce in April and May, when the grass turns green and the wildflowers come up across the flatland in rolling waves of color. Jeremiah brought her flowers from the range again, not one bunch now but frequently, tucked into his saddlebag on the ride home, and she always put them in water, and they always sat on the south windowsill under the blue and white curtains until they were past their time. She told him she was expecting a child on a May morning, in the way she told him most important things, simply and directly, looking at him with steady eyes. He was at the stove making coffee, his back to her, and he turned around when she said it and stood very still for a moment, and she watched his face move through something she could not entirely read. And then he crossed the small kitchen and took her hands and held them and said, "Tell me you're all right." "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am very happy." He pulled her into his arms and held her with the quiet, comprehensive warmth that was his specific way of showing the things he felt most deeply. And she rested her head against his chest and listened to his heart and felt, again, that specific and profound peace. He told Dale and Clara that evening, and Clara hugged Ida and cried in the way that women who have been fond of you do when they receive news that confirms their hopes for you. And Dale shook Jeremiah's hand and said that children were the best work a man ever did, and then immediately offered Jeremiah a very small raise because it seemed like the right thing to do. Summer passed in the full, warm labor of a working ranch in its most productive season, and by August Ida had adjusted to the changing shape of her body, with the same practical acceptance she applied to everything. And she was not a woman who spent her days in nervous anxiety, having lived through enough genuinely difficult things to know the difference between difficulty and manageable discomfort. She continued her accounting work sitting at the table in the cottage, which was easier than riding out to the ranch house, and Clara rode out to her twice a week to collect the work and bring new figures, which she said she was happy to do and meant it. Elias Cobb published a small notice in the Caldwell commercial about the expected arrival, which he phrased in the dignified language of a frontier newspaper with a fondness for the people it covered. And Hattie Bloom sent a package out to the cottage with a handmade quilt in yellow and white that was among the most beautiful things Ida had ever been given. The boy was born in October in the cottage with the south-facing window, attended by the local midwife, a practical and capable woman named Mrs. Tate, who had delivered approximately half the children born in Caldwell over the past decade. He came into the world with a good, strong voice and the kind of dark eyes that are common in new babies and may or may not hold their color, and he was healthy and whole and vigorous, and Jeremiah held him with the careful, slightly terrified reverence of a man holding something of absolute value for the first time. They named him Samuel Henry Fletcher, with Henry being Jeremiah's father's name, and they had decided on a boy's name and a girl's name in the late summer evenings in the cottage, and had arrived at the boy's name without any difficulty at all. Jeremiah looked at his son in his arms and then looked at his wife in the bed, tired and radiant in the specific way of women who have accomplished something enormous, and he said very quietly, "Ida." "I know," she said. She always knew what he meant, even when there was no more to it than her name, especially then. Samuel Henry Fletcher grew, as babies do, with a speed that consistently surprised everyone responsible for him, and he turned out to have his father's dark eyes after all, and his mother's practical focus, which manifested at the age of several months as a very serious interest in anything mechanical, reaching for the buckles on his father's saddlebag and the handles of his mother's account ledgers with equal determination. The winter of 1879, moving into 1880, was a hard one in Kansas, the kind that drives men out of the territory and deepens the roots of those who stay. The cottage held, because Jeremiah had spent the autumn making sure of it new chinking, a second layer of weatherproofing on the door, enough wood stacked to last well into spring. He was meticulous about preparation in the same way he was meticulous about everything, which was to say quietly, without announcement, but with the kind of thoroughness that left nothing to chance. Inside the cottage, with the wood stove well fed and the yellow quilt from Hattie on the bed, and Samuel in the small wooden cradle that Jeremiah had built himself with the same hands that had made the wildflower box, it was warm, more than warm. It was the specific warmth of a home that has been made on purpose, with care, by people who know what they are building and why. Ida sat at the table in the evenings working on the account books while Jeremiah sat across from her with Samuel propped against his arm, reading the history book he had ordered through Elias Cobb from a publisher in Kansas City, and the lamp threw its warm circle over all of them, and the winter wind did what it always did, and none of it could touch what was inside. She looked up from the ledger one evening and looked at him, at this man who had given a stranger a bed, and slept in a stable without a word and brought wildflowers from the open range, and carved her name into the history of a small Kansas town without ever making any of it loud. And she felt a love so complete and specific that it had its own geography, its own weather, its own particular quality of light. He looked up from his book at the same moment, the way people who are genuinely attuned to each other do, and their eyes met across the lamplit table in the warm cottage, and he gave her the full smile, the rare one, the one that was only ever for her. "Come to bed," he said. "The columns will wait." "They will," she agreed, and she set down her pen. Spring came back to Kansas in the way it always did, slow, and then suddenly, with the grass going green in long, rippling waves across the flatland and the birds returning, and the wildflowers coming up along the fence lines, and the creek banks in their particular defiant abundance. Samuel was 5 months old and increasingly interested in the world, tracking the movement of the horses in the paddock outside the cottage window with wide, concentrated eyes, and Jeremiah held him up at the window sometimes in the mornings to watch Gideon and the other horses move in the early light. Dale Prout offered Jeremiah a permanent foreman position that spring, with a small additional share of the operation in recognition of the past year's work, and Jeremiah accepted it on the condition that Ida's accounting work would continue to be compensated at its full rate, because he was not a man who assumed that his wife's professional labor was a free addendum to his own employment. Prout agreed without hesitation, because Clara had said exactly this would be a condition, and she was almost always right. They were not wealthy. They were not powerful or remarkable in any of the ways that the history books would notice. They were a foreman and his wife on a Kansas cattle ranch in the year 1880, working hard and building something real in a territory that was still finding its shape, where the injustices of the land, the displacement of the people who had lived here before, the inequalities that rode in with civilization's machinery, were visible in every corner if you were willing to look. And Ida and Jeremiah were both people who looked. They did not have the power to solve those things, but they dealt with every person who came to the ranch honestly and fairly, and with the kind of consistent human dignity that is its own small form of resistance to the larger failures. A family of homesteaders, a young couple named the Garcias with 2 small children, settled on a quarter section adjacent to Prout's property in the spring of 1880, and faced the immediate hostility that some of the town's longer-established residents directed toward newcomers who were not from the expected places. Jeremiah rode over to their claim with a roan horse and his hat in his hands and introduced himself and asked if they needed help with the fencing, because their equipment had arrived damaged in the freighting, and he spent 2 days helping the husband repair and set posts, and Ida brought food out to them and sat with the wife, whose name was Elena, and helped her understand the accounting she would need to do to keep the homestead claim properly recorded. It was not a heroic act. It was just the right thing, done without ceremony, which was the only kind of rightness that Ida and Jeremiah believed in. Elena Garcia and Ida became genuine friends over the following months, meeting in town on the days they both came in for supplies and exchanging the particular intelligence of women building lives in the same demanding landscape. Which merchants were fair, which doctors were competent, which of the church ladies were worth the trouble of their opinions and which were not. Their children, Samuel and the Garcias' youngest daughter Rosa, who was within months of him in age, regarded each other from their respective mothers' arms with the solemn mutual assessment of infants who have not yet learned to be divided by anything. The summer of 1880 was good to the ranch and good to the Fletcher cottage, and by autumn Ida was again quietly expecting, and this time she told Jeremiah while he was feeding Gideon in the small stable he had built behind the cottage, because she had learned that he received news best when his hands were doing something familiar. He set down the feed bucket and turned to her, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, that complex, open movement of a man who feels things as completely as he thinks them. "Is it right to be this happy?" he asked, and it was one of the very few times she had ever heard anything like uncertainty in his voice. "It is exactly right," she said. "It is the whole point." He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in the small stable with the old roan horse eating contentedly beside them, and the autumn evening coming down soft and gold over the Kansas plain, and the happiness was large and quiet and entirely real. The second child was a girl, born in February of 1881 in the same cottage with the same capable Mrs. Tate in attendance, and she had her mother's steady gray eyes and her father's capacity for absolute focus, which expressed itself in her very first weeks as an ability to sleep through almost anything except the absence of human warmth. They named her Alice Ruth, with Ruth being Ida's mother's name, and Hattie Bloom cried again when she was told, in exactly the same way she had cried at the wedding, and sent another quilt, this one in the softest pink and cream. Samuel, at 16 months, regarded his sister with the careful, territorial curiosity of a small boy who is deciding whether this development is acceptable, and then apparently decided it was when she curled her fingers around his much larger ones at their first formal introduction, and he looked up at his father with the most completely surprised expression Jeremiah had ever seen on a small human face. And Jeremiah laughed, the full, rare laugh, and Ida laughed. And even Alice, Ruth seemed to consider this development positive, because she did not cry. Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1881 was still a town on the edge of things, the trailing edge of the era that would eventually be called the Wild West in the stories that came later, when people had acquired the distance and the nostalgia to make it sound romantic. The cattle drives were beginning to wind down across the territory. The railroad was pushing its reach further in every direction. The open range was being fenced. The world was changing, as it always is, and the people who lived inside that change experienced it mostly as ordinary life, as work and weather and relationship and loss, and the daily increments of building something worth having. Jeremiah Fletcher was 30 years old and a foreman, and he rode the fence lines on Gideon in the mornings and kept the accounts of the Prout operation in close consultation with his wife, who remained the better mathematician of the two and knew it, and managed not to make him feel bad about it. He was a man who had found the thing worth stopping for and had stopped, and the stopping had not diminished him. It had expanded him, in the way that genuine love expands people if they let it. Ida Fletcher, she was fully Ida Fletcher now in name, and in the bone-deep sense of identity that comes with a life genuinely built, was 27 years old, and she ran the accounts of a successful cattle operation and raised 2 children in a cottage with a south-facing window and blue and white curtains, and she tended a garden behind the cottage that had grown, by the second summer, into something her mother would have admired. She grew tomatoes and beans and a long row of sunflowers along the south fence, not because sunflowers were practical, but because they were beautiful, and because her mother had always said that beauty was not a luxury but a necessity, and Ida had finally, after everything, decided to agree. The wooden box with the carved wildflowers sat on the windowsill beside the bed, and she had put things in it over the years. A pressed wildflower from September 1878, a small note Jeremiah had left her one morning in his careful, infrequent handwriting that said only back before dark, "Coffee's warm," and which she kept because it was so perfectly and completely him that it made her chest ache with love every time she saw it, and Samuel's first tooth, and a button from Alice Ruth's christening dress. Hattie Bloom came out to the ranch cottage on Sunday afternoons when the weather permitted, brought pie and took Samuel for walks around the paddock, while Jeremiah and Ida had an hour that was quieter than usual, and she watched the children with the focused satisfaction of a woman who has decided that the nearest thing to having your own family is helping to build someone else's. Elias Cobb published a brief note in the Caldwell commercial in May of 1881, not an article exactly, more of an editorial aside in his weekly column, in which he wrote that the quality of a community was measured not in its buildings or its commerce, but in the characters of the people who chose to make their lives within it, and that, in his observation, Caldwell was fortunate to have among its residents people of a quality worth noting. He did not name anyone specifically, which was good journalism, but several people in town read it and thought of Jeremiah Fletcher, and several others thought of Ida, and a few thought of both, which was exactly right. In the summer of 1881, they bought a small additional parcel of land adjacent to the cottage, a quarter-acre with a small creek running along its eastern edge, from a homesteader who was returning east. They bought it with money Ida had saved from her wages over 2.5 years, carefully and deliberately, entered in her ledger as a specific fund with a specific purpose, And when they stood on the land together on the afternoon of the purchase, with Samuel toddling in the grass and Alice Ruth in Jeremiah's arms and the creek running clear and low in the August heat, Jeremiah looked at it all and said, "Your father would have liked this." She had told him once that her father's highest form of appreciation was a calm, surveying look at something and the words, "That'll do." It was not that he couldn't say more. He just trusted that enough would be recognized for what it was. He would have said, "That'll do," she said. "That'll do," Jeremiah agreed, and she laughed. They built a small structure on the creek parcel over the autumn, nothing elaborate, just a good solid room with a roof and a proper floor, and the beginnings of what would, over the following years, expand into a proper house, larger than the cottage, with a kitchen and a bedroom for each of the children, and a sitting room with a south-facing window to match the one in the cottage that she had always loved. They did not do it all at once. They did it the way most things worth doing are done in stages, as the money and the time allowed, carefully and without cutting corners. The cottage stayed, eventually becoming a storage room and then a workroom where Ida kept her desk and her ledgers, and where Jeremiah kept his tools and his history books, the collection of which had grown considerably. It had a particular character by then, that cottage, the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in it and around it, and neither of them could quite bring themselves to repurpose it entirely, so they did not. Gideon retired from working cattle in the autumn of 1882, when he was old enough that Jeremiah judged it unkind to push him hard, and became a companion horse for the children, patient and gentle with Samuel's clumsy enthusiasm and Alice Ruth's tentative, but determined approach to everything. Jeremiah got a young gray horse for the working days, a mare he called River after the Picos, and she was quick and smart, and took a while to settle into the work but was worth the trouble. He said she reminded him of himself at her age, and Ida said she was not going to comment on that, and he gave her the full smile. She was sitting at her desk in the workroom cottage on an autumn evening in 1882, balancing the quarterly accounts for the Prout Ranch, which had grown and prospered, and now ran one of the larger cattle operations in the southern Kansas territory, when she stopped in the middle of a column and put down her pen, and looked at the wooden box on the windowsill and thought about the morning she had walked into a stable to thank a stranger for giving up a bed. She thought about the way the morning light had come in through the stable doors, gold and slanted and full of dust. She thought about his hands on the brush, moving in slow, careful strokes. She thought about the particular quality of silence that had existed between them even then, before they knew each other, a silence that was not empty but full. She thought about the $4.30 she had arrived with, and the cracked leather bag and the grief in her bones. She thought about the carved wildflowers on the box, and the cold steps, and the peach pie, and the October sky extravagant with stars. She thought about Samuel's first real laugh, the one that had surprised him so much he'd looked startled by it. She thought about Alice Ruth's small fingers curved around her brother's hand. She picked up her pen and went back to the column, but she was smiling with the particular fullness that comes when a life, taken as a whole, makes sense. When the grief and the hope and the struggle and the love are all of a piece, all part of the same story, none of it wasted. Jeremiah came into the workroom an hour later, carrying 2 cups of coffee, the way he always did when he saw the lamp lit and knew she was working late. He set 1 cup beside her ledger and the other on the opposite end of the table where he would sit, and he looked at her face as he sat down and saw something there that made him pause. "What?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. And then, because she had never given him less than the truth, "I was thinking about how we began." He sat with that for a moment, holding his coffee cup in both hands, and his eyes were warm and dark and steady in the lamplight. "You mean the stable," he said. "I mean the stable," she agreed. "I've thought about it too," he said. "Many times." "What do you think about it?" she asked, curious in the genuine way she was always curious about what was inside his quiet mind. He looked at her across the table, across the account books and the lamp and the 4 years they had built together in this place, and he said, with the precise care he gave to the things that mattered most. I think it was the best night's sleep I ever had. She laughed, the full laugh, the one that was only ever for him. And outside the workroom window, the Kansas night was full of stars, and the creek ran soft along the eastern edge of their land. And in the house, Samuel and Alice Ruth slept in their rooms in the uncomplicated way of children whose lives are warm and full. And Gideon stood quietly in the paddock under the enormous western sky, and everything that had come before. The grief and the stagecoach and the cracked leather bag and the $4.30 and the stranger who gave up a bed without a word. Everything had led here, to this lamplit room and this man and this life. And it was, in all the ways that mattered and several ways that could not quite be named, exactly enough. It was considerably more than enough. It was everything.